Eldritch horror is nothing new. The work of H.P. Lovecraft has inspired a lot of literary works and various visual media that we consume. From John Carpenter's The Thing to Stephen King's The Mist, down to, more recently, The Lighthouse. The Eldritch horror genre is built on themes of fearing the unknown, being out of control, and the crushing weight of being utterly helpless in the wake of something so grand and larger than life. Most famously in monsters like Cthulhu. These themes and fears are the same reason so many people have a phobia of the ocean, the vast unknown of which lies below, the lack of control, and the crushing weight as you're utterly helpless at the waves of the sea and nature herself. So, it makes sense that so much mythology, folklore, and horror stories lie somewhere between the two, with tales from sailors lost at sea and the horrifying encounters that have inspired so much of modern horror, all of which is so present in today's topic. I'm Sin. This is the history, meaning, and estranged ideas that lie and Still Wakes the Deep. Quick refresh. Still Wakes the Deep is a horror title that covers a Lovecraftian-style tragedy that develops on a deep-sea oil rig. You play as Kaz, a Scottish electrician seeking refuge from the mainland while on the run from the police. Kaz has beat a man to a bloody pulp at a bar, and is trying to work on the oil rig until things tide over. So instead of spending Christmas with your wife and 2 kids, you're the newbie on the Beira Delta oil platform. The game kicks off meeting the many characters aboard the Scottish rig, including Finlay, Ines, Muir, Roper, Scooby, and most importantly, Roy. Roy is your friend who brought you on this rig in hopes to try and mild out the mess you caused at home. He was a drunken mess of a man, same as you, before he found his faith in God. And after meeting the cast aboard the rig, you're called to Rennick's office. He's the installation manager aboard the Beira Delta platform. You're being called in, well, because your actions have finally caught up to you, as the police called him, and Rennick is cooperating and turning you over. But amidst the argument, Rennick's phone rings. The drill hit something, and is stopped in its tracks. In the most typical fashion, Rennick pushes them to keep drilling through whatever they've hit. And as you board the helicopter to go back to the mainland, an explosion erupts and knocks you off the rig. What surfaced from below was a large monster called the Shape, a tendril biomass that spreads and grows to the platform, parting its walls and floors while it spreads itself onto people and taking them victim as their host. For the next 3 to 4 hours, through the game is sequence after sequence of on-the-edge survival, trying to find means of escaping that all go as catastrophically bad as possible. Swinging down counterweights in puzzles, restarting generators, and trying to help others, all while trying to just remain alive. Hiding, running, and swimming away from the crew members you once called friends and peers. Plunging yourself into the darkest depths, terrifying heights, and the most intense chase sequences. With each new chapter, your objectives shift, and the scope of what you're dealing with becomes all the more grand, as the toll from the crew becomes larger and larger, and through it all, your motivation is clear. Get home to your family. And it becomes all the more gut-wrenching as the losses stack, and the odds become greater. It becomes clear that's not an option. And Kaz makes the ultimate sacrifice to save the mainland. Still Wakes the Deep wears its influence on its sleeves, with the most obvious being The Thing. The lead designer, Rob McLaughlin, says, "Our elevator pitch was The Thing, on an oil rig." He goes on to say that it built up the core background and setting of the game. But it's clear to anyone who plays this game, the Cold War inspiration and struggle against your community reflects the struggling interpersonal relationships of Kaz. It's not the core message of this game, but Still Wakes the Deep leverages the personal conflict to tell a story that is centered around faith. To get one thing plainly out of the way, Kaz, our protagonist, isn't a good person. The opening of the game starts on an open shot of the sea, as you read a letter sent overseas from your wife. Your actions back home and continued running from your problems through your life have led you to this low point, away from your family. And your wife sends out a plea for you to make amends and fix what you've started, or it's going to spell the end of your family. Kaz tries to find consolement from your one piece of home on this floating rig in Roy, between your upending relationship with your wife, talking about divorce, and what is surely the police catching up to you. Roy's only suggestion is you go back and just face your consequences you've been running from, with the specific key line, "The Lord loves you, mate, no matter what." And I'm pretty sure Suze does too, with the implication of repentment and faith. Faith in God, God's good faith in you, and the love, trust, and faith in between Suze and Kaz. That seeking retribution is your answer, and that this conflict is an internal one. This is repeated to you, not but 5 minutes later. As you fall in the water, you encounter your first psychedelic, trippy flashback, as you recall the moments before you left to board the rig. As Suze scolds you, Roy chimes in, and is shut down to say he was no more of a mess until recent, and Roy rebuttals, saying he's changed as he seeked out reform, repenting, and found his faith, and insinuates that Kaz wouldn't be in the situation if he had done the same with him, where the theme of running from your problems is carried through the gameplay and core loop as Kaz never stands and fights, with multiple literal chase sequences, and most of the game spent hiding away from the shape as the problem grows further. It becomes a more literal analogy of Kaz running from his problems, and his internal conflict becoming an external one, where this comes to a head and full circle just before the final chapter. You have a brief phone call with Roy. Unbeknownst to Kaz, this is the last time they would speak. He reiterates the same line in the game's intro. Suze loves you, and Jesus loves you too. With the fun twist this time, but everyone else thinks you're a cunt. And his passing becomes the turning point for the final chapter of the game. And in the final conclusion, the game puts you on a trippy vision as you pass into the afterlife, recalling your life, specifically your relationship with Suze and the growth of your family. And when you reach the light, you're awoken next to Suze, back in your bed at home. You're able to walk around and explore old photos of your family, check in on your wife, and it becomes clear you succeed in your goal. You got home to your family, and all you had to do was stop running. Believe in the faith between you and your family, and face the consequence of what's brought you to this point. When you open the door to your bedroom, you find yourself back at the sea. And just like in the opening, a letter from your wife is read aloud. But this time it's not a plea for you to fix things, but it's a plea for you to come back home to them, and that they'll be alright, because it's her speaking post-mortem in remembrance, and the story comes to a circle right where it began. The exact same message that has been left to you and foreshadowed through the entire game, that what lies at the end of your repenting is the love bestowed upon you through faith, and is the only way to carry on your goal, where the choice decision of opening and closing on water can symbolize a lot. It's likely a reflection of your current situation and relationship, finding you in rough waters, and can be seen as something from Kaz's perspective at the beginning, insurmountable and uncontrollable, or even to call his marriage a wash, where toward the end, it can literally represent a wake, which doubles as a rough body of water, but also a time of remembering and observing during a funeral, or even Kaz's final resting place, as his return to nature. But together, it gives a more visceral idea of cleansing. Water symbolizes a transformation, drastic change, and healing in a lot of ways, bringing everything together and coming full circle. This sort of symbolism and meaning goes a step further when you consider the naming of things. Obviously, it plays reference to the shape that is awoken from below the rig, but it's also a play on the realization of the deep trouble that Kaz finds himself in, and even the waking deep faith in his family and that everything will be alright after his passing in the final conclusion. The shape being named so similar to the thing is no mistake, as mentioned before, but it finds its inspiration in mythology and real-world mycology. The work of Lovecraft played a lot into stories of mythology, most famously Cthulu being somewhat similar to the Kraken. But the Kraken has just as much history in Scottish folklore specifically, with the game's overall plot reflecting the ending of the poem, The Kraken, by Alfred Lord Tennyson. There hath he lain for ages and will lie, battering upon huge sea worms in his sleep, until the latter fire shall heat the deep. Then once by man and angels to be seen, in roaring he shall rise, and on the surface die. But the touches on Scottish folklore don't just stop there, where the history of mermaids, sirens, or specifically selkies, that would mimic people bringing others to their death, just like the overtaken crew aboard the Beira Delta. But the structure, shape, and even behavior has real-world inspiration too. Being inspired by real-world fungi, the shape grows out like that of the mycelium of a giant mushroom forming before your eyes, taking over individuals like the parasitic zombie fungi Gibella pulchra, which is the same fungus that inspired much of The Last of Us. Fungi and mushrooms would also give some validation to the psychedelic visions and splotches we endure throughout the course of the game. And this pattern of real-world inspiring fiction goes a step further, when you realize that the setting in this game is loosely inspired by the Piper Alpha disaster, the largest oil rig disaster in history, where in 1978, out in Scottish waters, the Piper Alpha platform would erupt into flames after a safety accident, and 168 men aboard would tragically lose their lives. It's clear there's enough evidence to say this is a major inspiration for the game. From the name of the platform in the game being Beira Delta, which is a little too familiar to the Piper Alpha, to the petroleum company being the Cthulu Petroleum, which in its naming and specifically its logo is extremely similar to the Occidental, or for short, the Oxy Petroleum Corporation, that owned the Piper Alpha platform. This naming scheme reflects that of real life, but goes even a step further, as it's completely based in Scottish dialect and mythology, where the name of the platform, Beira Delta, is named after the Scottish goddess of winter, Beira, a harsh, cold goddess who is ruthless in punishment, which also fits the game's setting, since the game takes place on Christmas. She's the one who built the world's landscape and weather, and represents nature in a large part. And the shape attacking an oil rig can be seen as a classic play on nature versus human. Similarly, the name of the oil company, Cthulu, is Scottish Gaelic for sleep, as in the monster that sleeps beneath the platform, where all these inspirations and real-world references to different horror titles and the dense history of Scotland is enriching. But even with all these ties, there still lies such a stark difference between Still Wakes the Deep and all of that which it builds off of. The major thing that kept eating at me all through my playthrough was the difference in the ending tone. The Thing used its claustrophobic setting to build a story around distrust. The work of Lovecraft was meant to give people a sense of dread. And though these are still small themes that Still Wakes the Deep has, its hard-hitting tragic ending reflects that of a positive note, with glimpses of hope and heavenly sight and horror, giving light at the end of the tunnel. Literally, using real history, mythology, tragedy, and the fiction that surrounds us to not tell a horror story, but a hopeful one, about finding faith, facing consequences, rebirth, and at the end of times, love. Hey, thanks so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed this, let me know what you think below. tell me your own references and personal anecdotes that maybe I missed out on. I'd love to hear about it in the comment section. If you've made it this far and you want to see more stuff like this, hit the subscribe button. Anyway, until next time, bye-bye.